All right, it's a little bit past 7 o'clock now. Actually, it's 7 o'clock exactly. But we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll go ahead and start with a prayer here in a moment. This is your last time with us, right, Abby? So you're leaving Sunday morning, so make sure you get your hugs and goodbyes in tonight, because there's not going to be another chance. So, and then, will we not see you for like an entire 3 years, or will you come back like maybe in a year? All right. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you, and we'll be thinking about you and praying for you. And I know that you're probably excited and all that. So, anyways, but we'll miss you. We're glad that we had you for the whole summer and into the fall, and we'll definitely miss your contributions for sure. Let's go ahead and start with the prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this time that we get to open up your word and to study it, and pray that you help us with that, and pray that you just help us as we go forward into the rest of our week and always to be applying your word to our life. And we just thank you for this time that we have to not just study and to grow in our knowledge of you, but to also encourage one another and stir each other up. And so we thank you for this. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So last week, I think the theme verse as you're looking at this section of Ecclesiastes, which I think basically like chapter 3 to the end of chapter 5 are kind of one section. That's in chapter 3, it starts off with that famous, poem, you could call it, where it's talking about all the different times and experiences and seasons that we go through and have as human beings. And he kind of comes to this conclusion, and I think this is something that he's kind of going back to throughout the rest of this section through the end of chapter 5, where he says he's made everything beautiful in its time, that he's speaking about God, and he's put eternity into man's heart so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And so the main thing I want to focus on, because we talked about the second part of that verse a little bit, but the main thing I want to focus on is that claim, because that's really quite a claim, isn't it? That you can go through, and on that list in that poem of all the things we go through, there's good things on there, but there's also bad things. And what Solomon says is that, there's really two claims built into that basically God's in control, that he's kind of directing things, and he's involved even in human affairs, and he's kind of set the world up in a certain way, and he has a purpose for the circumstances that we go through in life. But then there's a second claim there, and that's that basically, God knows what he's doing. He's made everything beautiful in its time. Some of your versions say, that he's made everything appropriate in its time. The idea is that there's a purpose there. And the idea is that as we go through this is kind of developing this trust as we go through the ins and outs and ups and downs, that we're trusting God, trusting that he knows what he's doing. And so it's one thing to make that claim, but that's quite a claim. And I think Solomon kind of anticipates Objections, and even probably himself, as he comes to this conclusion and makes this claim, is thinking about his own struggles with that idea. And so he brings up things, all the way through to the end of chapter 4. And we looked at the first two last week, where he brings up unjust courts. It's this idea that if God's in control, what's with these unjust court systems where people, who are innocent, they're being sentenced for crimes they didn't commit. We can imagine all the different injustices that happen within a court system, not just back then, but even still to this day. And so you go through this list, and a lot of these things are claims that you really would still hear today. If you were telling somebody that there is a God, that he's in control, that we're all going to have to answer to him, maybe the first 6 things that somebody would bring up is this list right here, right? And maybe not in this order, but people will say, what about injustice and the court systems and all the things, horrible things that happen to people? And then secondly, he says, death comes to us all. And so, you can have a great life. You can do amazing things compared to other human beings that we interact with and have relationships with. But at the end, the same thing happens to us all. We all end up dying. And so he's asking, what's with that? And then you look around, and similar to the first objection, that there's oppression and there's people being oppressed, and the pervasiveness of envy and wealth and loneliness and the temporary nature of popularity are all kind of things that I think he brings up in this section. And so, as I said, we looked at the first two, and so we want to start in chapter 4 tonight, and we'll just kind of go through this chapter and hopefully finish it up this evening as well. And so, can I get somebody to read chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. All right, so what Solomon does throughout this book, and he makes some claims that are shocking. Probably the most shocking claim or thing that he says in Ecclesiastes is that verse 3, that it's better than both is he who's not yet been born and has not seen the evil deeds that are under the sun. What he does is he tends to look at life strictly from under the sun. Like if this is all there is, and somebody has this oppressed existence, and all we see is oppression, he says the one that's in a better position than both, even better than the guy who's dead, is the guy who's never been born, the guy who never has existed. So he's looking at life kind of cynically and kind of from almost an atheistic standpoint, saying, okay, if this is all there is, it's better to not have ever existed at all. But even more than that, I kind of want to go through this, and there's a few things that stand out to me, right? So he's talking about people who have been oppressed under the sun, and their tears, and he says there's nobody to comfort them. And then he says on the side of their oppressors there was power and there was no one to comfort them. But I again want to focus on verse 3. He says, it's better than both is he who has not yet been, has not seen. So he's not just talking about people who are being oppressed. He's talking about just the toll it takes on you just to witness the oppression that takes place on the earth. And so one question I want to ask is, what impact has technology and information had when it comes to us witnessing and seeing and being aware of oppression that takes place on this planet Earth? Bombarded with more of it? How so? What do you mean by that? Okay, it's all out there in front of you all the time. Okay, through what mediums? All of them, right? So pretty much anything that has a screen, right? And so you turn on your phone, and what do? We scroll, right? We have our news sources, Fox News, CNN, maybe not even that. You go on Twitter, you go on Facebook, and the moment something happens, seems like there's somebody there, right? And so you almost get this impression that there's just bad things happening constantly, and guess what? That's probably because there are bad things happening constantly. And what we have with technology is something that even Solomon didn't have at his disposal, but he says, I see all the oppressions, it's plural, that are under the sun. Solomon probably had witnessed quite a few oppressions take place in his lifetime, hadn't he? Being king and having the connection and the reach that he had, having the relationships with other kings, we kind of talked about that. He was aware of oppressions in the plural, wasn't he? But we turn on our phones and we're seeing bad things happen all the time. If that's all we focus on, what does that do? If all we're doing is taking in information, if all we're doing is constantly observing the news, which, by the way, the news, they don't make money giving us good news. They make money giving us bad news. If that's all that we do, and that's the information we take in all the time, what does that do to our hearts, to a person? Yeah, so how so? What do you mean by that?
Well, he's talking about everything being futile and vain and gosh, it's better to be dead than hope, even better than that is to have never been born.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds pretty down to me.
Yeah. So if you just focus on everything that's wrong in the world, and man, we could list, there's terrible things happening right now, right? Right? If you dwell on that, all the terrible things, you could really think about that, and you can think about it constantly. Man, it will take you to that dark place. Before long, you'll be saying the same thing, that, man, it's better than to be one of these people who has been delivered from it. Go ahead. Yeah.
Along with that, your conversations all of a sudden are about the news.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear this and you hear that. And that's not encouraging me.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing that stands out to me, unless somebody has something else to add, that's a good point, though, Becky. The other thing that stands out is that Solomon's the king, and as I kind of read this, it seems like he's talking specifically about like probably political oppression, because he's talking about how you have these oppressors and how the power is on their side. And we would like to complain about political oppression, but we're in a pretty good spot in this day and age, and that could change, of course, but we're in a good spot right now. But he says they had no one to comfort them. And again, he's writing this as king, right? So he has the power in many cases to do something, but he says there's no one to comfort them as he looked out and he sees all this oppression. So what's going on there? How can the king say there's nobody to do it? Because he could cure some oppression, couldn't he? Think about Jesus. Remember when Jesus was being anointed with oil by Mary Magdalene, was it? Do I have that mixed up? Was it Martha or Mary Magdalene? Now I'm mixed up in my head. I think it was Mary, right? Yeah, anyways. And what was the objection Judas brought up? What was his problem with that? Yeah, you're wasting money. And how did Jesus respond to it? You guys remember what he said? He said, "You'll always have the poor with you, but I'm only with you for this little bit of time," is kind of the paraphrase, right? When you look at Solomon from his standpoint, he probably could have cured some oppression, but could he cure all of it? Now, that's not an excuse for us not to do it, but the point is that no matter where you're at in history, no matter where you're at in the world, there's always going to be problems, there's always going to be injustices, there's always going to be oppression. And I think about how discouraging it is for me, right, when you get on this news kick and you're just constantly taking in that type of information. But imagine for a second, if you really think about it, even if you're taking in all the news that the world has to offer, you're still only getting a tiny sliver of just how bad things really are in this world. Imagine what God sees on a daily basis, right? Imagine what he sees that we don't read about, that nobody else ever finds out about, that happens behind closed doors, right? That remain in secret. And I think about that, and it's amazing. People complain and they look at what took place in Genesis 6 with God flooding the world. But if you really think about all the evil that likely takes place on this earth and what God sees constantly, every second of every day, it's really by the grace of God that you and I are still standing here, right? That we still have breath in our lungs to be able to offer complaints to God. It's really amazing when we think about it. And so as Solomon goes through these, I want us to notice that he doesn't yet offer okay, here's the objection, now here's the answer to that objection. That's not how he writes it. By the time we get to chapter 5, I think he'll go into that a little bit more. But for now, he's just kind of bringing up problems and things that he recognizes. And I guess what I want us to see is that these aren't different problems than what we deal with today, okay? Anybody else before we keep moving on here in the text? No. All right, so let's go on to verse 4. And can somebody read verses 4 through 6 for me? 4 through 6. All right, so what is Solomon, especially in verse 4, what is he kind of describing there? What would it maybe have looked like back then compared to what it looks like now for us today? And just to kind of help us, ESV says, I saw that all the toil and skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and striving after wind. And King James Version translates it a little different. Maybe some other versions do too. So this is, I think it could go either way in the grammar. But it says, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. So you have a little bit different way of translating those two, but I think they're kind of getting down to the same thing. So to ask the question again, what does this kind of look like that Solomon's talking about here in our life, in modern times? Okay, climbing the corporate ladder, yeah. Keep up with the Joneses. Yeah, that's true. Keep up with the Joneses. Keep up with the Kardashians. Yeah. Not just the Joneses. But what else? Anybody else? So it's kind of like this ultra-competitive spirit, isn't it? The first way it's translated there, it's almost like he's saying that every motivation for people achieving something great it's driven by envy. It's driven by jealousy. And I think we see that a lot. In fact, when you type in competition, this is what the word that popped into my mind when I read this is competition. And you type in competition into Google Images, just about every photo that pops up initially looks something like this one, right? That corporate ladder that Dan is talking about, and it's not just in corporate settings, it's just in work in general. Sometimes it's not just simply work, but trying to have the same stuff that everybody else has or have better stuff than what everybody else has. And so what he's really talking about here is this competitiveness that exists amongst mankind. And so, it's interesting because in America, is competitiveness a good thing or a bad thing? Good thing or bad thing? Yes? Okay. What do you mean by yes?
Well, it's good that it keeps you motivated.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Bad is that it becomes consuming.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's the truth of it. But I think in America, if you're just going to pull, hey, competitiveness, good thing or bad thing, a lot of people would say yes, right? I mean, we love our sports teams. We like comparing ourselves to other nations and saying that we're better than you. We like to say, hey, go and get that money and you do well and you got to be great and be better than everybody else. But we can see how, as Dan said, that can kind of consume you. So what are I guess I'll ask this question because I don't know how else to ask it, and that's really tiny. But is competitiveness ever healthy in daily life? And I think that we've kind of talked about that a little bit. But if it is, when does competitiveness become unhealthy or wrong? Okay.
That's all that there is I got to be better than this person, I got to have better than that. If you're consumed by it, it eats you up inside.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's when your reasoning changes.
Okay.
So if your reasoning for your competitiveness has a benefit in some way, or you or your family or someone you're serving or something else, it's great, but if it becomes to the point that you just want to look better than everybody else, or whatever it is you're doing, you've got an unhealthy wrong mark.
Okay. Yep. Good points. Anybody else? I like the idea about the motivation. When our motivation is just to be better than everybody else around us, that really becomes a problem. And is there any way that this problem of competitiveness, to the point where it's unhealthy, is there any way that this has maybe become worse, again, in our modern times with technology and things like that? Is there anything that kind of aggravates this problem or brings this problem to the forefront even more so than maybe in generations past? Yeah, what about technology?
You can get it faster.
What's that?
You can get it faster.
Get it faster, get what faster?
Anything.
Just anything, right? Okay, yep.
Maybe advertising itself.
Yeah, advertising, yeah, I gotta have that, yeah.
Well, it's the surface level.
Yeah,
It's just most of what you see in people is when they're air fresh, and that's not what they look like in real life.
Mm.
You see, like, even on Facebook, people that all their posts are constantly positive and, oh, look how great my life is, and we all know that that's not the whole story.
Yeah.
It's not the whole picture.
Mhm.
It's that surface level, you're not seeing what's underneath, and so it makes us doubt ourselves because we think, that's the level I should be at or whatever.
yeah, yeah,
It's not the truth.
yeah. When's the last time, like, the kids were screaming and you're fighting and yelling at your spouse and you say, honey, let's take a picture and, oh, that's nice, let's post that on Facebook, right? Nobody does that. And yet we all have those moments. Amy, you had your hand raised.
I look at this all very discreet, and I would say they want to gamify everything.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that. It's an adrenaline rush every time you do it. There is a reason people are addicted to social media and addicted to their phones. And I think then once you cut building that up, it's just like anything else. I mean, go ask an addict. It takes more and more to get that hit. And so I do think it's a build up of right now we have to get competitive in
Yeah, part of the appeal of social media in some ways is trying to show people that you have a better life than everybody else, right? In that sense, it's gamified as well. There's even an app called Be Real, if you've heard of that. And the idea was like, you'll get, I don't know exactly how it works. Probably Isaac and Abby know better than I do. But how does it work? Explain it. Do you know?
Neither of us use it, but you take a picture of what you're doing, like an alarm goes off at a certain time of day.
Yeah.
You have to take a picture of at that moment. So like, be real.
Right.
But we know people like to wait to take a picture of their so they get to see.
Yeah, exactly. You can still game it, right? You can still, your hair's all messed up, and you can manipulate it in a way that you're still giving a good picture to everybody in the world, right? And so, social media, you just scroll through social media. It's not just the news, right? But it's just seeing everybody's life, and there's always a freeze frame of somebody happy and smiling and in front of their new car or in front of their house that's bigger than the one I own or whatever it may be. And you get this false perception that everybody else's life is great, it's exciting, they're on adventures, and then there's me, right? And I'm bored and my life is this or it's that. When the reality is, what we're seeing on social media is not reality. It's just one side. It's a snapshot in time, and maybe they smile and then they do go back to arguing together, So how can we avoid that? Because there's kind of two. Well, I shouldn't say there's two sides of this, but I guess in the New King James Version, there's two sides where, you do something and the result is everybody's just jealous of you, right? But how do we avoid being caught up in this, being the ones that envy other people? What are some things that maybe we can do that will help us avoid that? Because it seems like something that was just so prevalent as Solomon looked at the world, it seemed like this was even people's motivation for doing the things that they did. How can we kind of prevent ourselves from getting caught up in that, do you think?
First of all, put God first.
Okay, put God first, yeah.
You do that, you don't have time to do that.
Yeah, it's true.
Sometimes focus on what we don't have and what other than that, but you focus on what you have and maybe what you don't have.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Not focusing on what we don't have, but focusing on what we do have, yeah. Go ahead, Becky.
So another thing is, if you love your brother,
Mhm.
and they have a good fortune, you're happy for them.
Yeah.
You're not jealous of them, and you love them.
Yeah, rejoice with those who rejoice, right?
Another thing I do is, my dad is I clean house.
Yeah.
I'm like, who knows their
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe if we have 10 social media accounts, maybe delete one. That might be a good first step, right? Go ahead. Sorry, say that again. Oh yeah, just be content, right? Yeah, and easier said than done, I think, but that is the goal. Solomon, he goes on and he offers this. Again, mine's kind of subset in my Bible where it looks like a poem here. These proverbial statements that he gives. And I think that when you recognize just how competitive the world is, we say the world is a dog-eat-dog world, right? And there's some of us, and maybe all of us, have recognized that at one point or another. There's a lot of ways, well, not a lot of ways, there's a few ways in which people might respond to that, and I think that's what Solomon is speaking to. I think the first one, and the first way you might respond, is just to be lazy. Just say, you know what, I'm not even going to go down that road. I'm not even going to work because, I don't want people to be jealous of me, and I don't want to be jealous of other people. And so he says, the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh, right? So just do nothing. Just totally uninvolve yourself in the world, uninvolve yourself in work, uninvolve yourself in a vocation. And, the result is that, especially back then, you'd starve to death, right? You'll consume your own flesh. But he goes on to say this: better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands of toil and striving after wind. What does that mean? I think that there's 2 extremes, right? You can just be lazy and have nothing to do with it. The other extreme is to say, okay, I'm going to have every bit of it, and I'm going to be the best of the best of the best, and that's going to put you down an endless path. But what's maybe the in-between? I think that might be what Solomon's getting at here. So what's he saying, and what does he mean when he says better to have a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after wind? What does he mean by that?
Calm yourself down.
Okay?
Put God first in your life and meditate on God and calm yourself down. Let your focus be solely on God.
All right. Yep.
And that will cause you to back up in life where you're not going to be out there trying to be the better person. You don't need to be.
Yeah. So not focusing on all the physical, but focusing on quiet time with God. I like that. Yeah. Anybody else?
You go back to what Ronnie said with keeping things,
Mhm.
allow you to have some peace, not feel like you have to strive for the Lord.
Right.
Focus on what you have.
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe there's a few Proverbs, too, that are similar to this, so I'll read some of those. Proverbs 15:16, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. You know, there's a lot of ways to make money that aren't honest, that are ungodly, aren't there? And if you're just willing to do whatever it takes to get rich, there's a lot of opportunity out there. But in the end, he says, you know, it's better to have a little with the fear of God than great treasure and trouble with it. Better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice. Kind of the same idea. Paul says this, and I think this is what Ronnie was getting at as well. Godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can't take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing with these, we'll be content. So it's that old saying, right? You don't see a U-Haul following a hearse, right? That's, you know, you can't take all this stuff with us, and so in the final analysis, nobody's going to be taking the houses, the cars, the money. You can't take any of that with you. There's your relationship with God and the treasures that you've stored up through serving Him, and that's all we're left with. And so, you know, it's interesting. I think that we pride ourselves on being busy in this country, just being busy, being busy, being busy. If you're not busy, you're doing something wrong. And I see Solomon kind of making this point that there's such a thing as balance, you know, to work hard, yeah, do that, and we have tons of scriptures that tell us to, but to also have that quiet time, right, and to avoid that strife. And so, you know, we talk about being bored a lot in this country. Isn't being bored a blessing? There's some people that do not have the privilege of being bored, right? So next time you say, man, I'm bored, say, praise God, right? Praise God, I'm bored. I think really the difference between boredom and contentment, there's probably several things, but one thing that stands out to me, boredom versus contentment, I think the only difference sometimes is thankfulness, right? Being grateful that I'm bored and there's no drama, there's no problems, that I have this luxury to live in this country and to be bored. That is a blessing from God. And so, you know, handful of work and a handful of quietness, right? Rather than having two hands full go at work. Anybody want to add anything else before we move on and keep reading here? No? Okay. So he goes on in verses 4, chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. So can I get somebody to read those verses for me, please? 7 through 12.
Then I returned, and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This is also vanity and a great misfortune. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him. The threefold cord is not quickly broken.
All right, so when you read the beginning here, you almost get this impression of somebody who has everything, but at the same time has nothing, right? Kind of maybe a Scrooge type of character where they have all the possessions in the world, but they don't have people in their life. They don't have relationships. And I guess I see that in verse 8 where he says, there's a person without a companion, without even a son or brother, and though there is no end to all his struggles or his work, his eyes are still not content with riches. So this is somebody that has riches, and what they want is more riches. And they just want it so bad that that's become the only thing in their life. They have no relationships. And so how often do we read about people having extreme wealth but being extremely lonely? Whether it's because, they lose everything, they lose their spouse, they lose their kids through a divorce, or situations like that. We just see it all the time. And it's that old adage that money doesn't buy happiness. There's one guy that comes to mind. His nickname is Notch. He invented the game Minecraft. Anybody hear of Minecraft? I think Ray plays it all the time, right, Ray? This is one of your favorites. No? Okay. Nobody here about Minecraft, really? There's got to be somebody. Okay, all right. You play it? You used to. Okay. Anyways, so you know the name of this guy who created it? No? Okay. I don't know his real name. It's like Marcus Persons or something like that. His nickname is Notch. That's what everybody calls him. I don't know why. That's what they call him. So he invented Minecraft probably, 10 or 15 years ago, something like that. And he ended up selling it. And he sold it to Microsoft. Anybody want to take a guess at how much money he sold Minecraft for to Microsoft? Any guesses? Over, under? What do you think? No? All right. $2.5 billion. He sold a video game to Microsoft, all right? So he's got like stupid amount of money for creating a video game. And this is what he tweeted out. This has been a few years now, and I just kind of saved some of the tweets. Let me get a little closer because I can't see it either. But he tweets out, he says, "I'm hanging out in Ibiza with a bunch of friends and partying with famous people, able to do whatever I want, and I've never felt more isolated." Another time he tweets, "The problem with getting everything is you run out of reasons to keep trying, and human interaction becomes impossible due to imbalance." Another time he says, "I found a great girl, but she's afraid of me and my lifestyle and went with a normal person instead." Another time he says, "In Sweden, I'll sit around and wait for my friends with jobs and families to have time to do things, watching my reflection in the monitor." And I apologize, there's profanity there. But, this guy is lonely. He has everything, and at the same time, he has absolutely nothing, right? I mean, how many of us would say, I would love to have $1 billion, but you start accumulating that amount of wealth, and it doesn't even have to be anywhere near that amount of wealth, and all of a sudden it becomes really lonely. And I've known some really wealthy people. I've came across them, and there's strife in family. Sometimes it's not even their own fault. And, there's something about money that kind of alienates people and causes people to be isolated. I think this was something that Solomon recognized, that he was kind of, maybe in some ways, on an island. He had all those wives and concubines, and he had all that stuff, but perhaps he didn't have relationships. And so this is what he goes on to say in verses 9 through 12, that two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fail, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. And how can one keep warm alone, and through a man might prevail against one who is alone? Two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. So why are two better than one, according to Solomon? Why should we prioritize relationships even, over work, over obtaining possessions? Why are two better than one? Good, moral support, yep. What else? Yeah, that's kind of the last one, right? Though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him, right? Have each other's backs. What else? I guess I kind of categorize these in three ways, right? He talks about if somebody falls, put in dance words, you'll have support, right? One will lift up his fellow. I put there encouragement. Things can be going great on your own for a while, but what happens when you fall? What happens when things take a turn and you've isolated yourself? When there's two, you have somebody to pick you up. You have somebody to encourage you. He talks about two lying together to keep warm, that surrounding ourselves with people and prioritizing relationships, we have comfort. And the last one, Becky talked about, we have help when we're, facing challenges, or in that context, in a fight, I guess. Let's avoid fights. But, He says a threefold cord is not easily broken. But I look at all those, and I think the ultimate fulfillment of those, in my mind at least, and I don't know if Solomon had this in mind or not, but it's the marriage relationship. You know, God creates Adam, and he says it's not good that man's alone, and he creates Eve to be his helpmeet, to be his companion. I think that's the ultimate fulfillment of that. But in all our relationships, you know, having the Christian community, that's why it's so important to come to services, to attend Bible classes, to surround ourselves with Christians as often as possible, because there's going to be a time where we need somebody. And actually, there might be a time where somebody needs you, and are we going to put ourselves in a position to actually do that? And so finally, he goes on, after pointing out some of these problems, he goes on in verses 13 through 15. Somebody want to read that for me, verses 13 through 15.
Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king, who no longer knows how to heed warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. Want me to keep going?
Sorry, verse 16. He went to I said verse 15. Go ahead and read verse 16. I apologize.
No end to all the people who were before them, but those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless and chasing after wind.
All right. So again, Solomon's pointing out all these things, and it's like saying, okay, if God's in control, what's with this? If he's made everything beautiful in its time, what's with this? And it's interesting that he kind of starts chapter 4 by talking about, you know, oppressors versus the oppressed, and these people that have power to basically treat people any way that they want. And who has more power to treat people the way that they want than a king, right? And so he kind of ends this section talking about, you know, it's kind of the opposite end of that. So he says, it's almost like he's saying, okay, let's say that you reach the pinnacle, you've reached the top, you've been king, much like Solomon, a guy who was king, who had many great accomplishments. He says, and to kind of describe somebody, that they get to this point where they no longer take advice. He says, a poor and wise youth is better than a foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. And so in verse 14, I think he's kind of imagining this youth who he goes up from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been poor. In verse 15, he says, I saw all the living who move about under the earth, or under the sun, rather, and along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. In some of your Bibles, I think in my CSB, verse 15, actually, the word that is translated that on the screen there in verse 15 is actually the word second. So it's like he introduces a second youth. So the picture, I think, that's being painted is you have a king, and he's aged, and he is succeeded by some poor youth that left prison and ascended to the throne, kind of like I think about Joseph, right? I mean, who was second in command before Joseph? And that guy got replaced by this guy that came out of prison, right? And then it's like he mentions, okay, but even that guy who ascends and he becomes king and he has this incredible backstory, a second youth comes along and even replaces him. And so I think the idea is like you can reach this level of greatness and popularity, but what eventually happens to that? How long does it last? Not very long, right? I mean, today's hero is tomorrow's bum. Isn't that the case? That whoever's popular today, whoever people are drawn to today, oftentimes, I mean, well, always actually, that's fleeting, isn't it? Maybe you've seen the play Wicked. There's a song called Popular. I won't sing it for you. I was going to have Andy sing it, but he's not here tonight. But anyways, in the lyrics there, it says, when I see depressing creatures with unprepossessing features, I remind them on their own behalf to think of celebrated heads of state or specially great communicators. Did they have brains or knowledge? Don't make me laugh. They were popular. Please, it's about being popular. It's not about aptitude. It's the way you're viewed. And so it's very shrewd to be very, very popular like me. Maybe one day I'll sing that for you, right? But we prioritize popularity. And not only being popular, but we like things that other people like. And that's the other side of this. I think a lot of us here would not consider ourselves popular. But what does it teach us about maybe being in the crowd and being, surrounded by people that are drawn to somebody that's popular? What might this kind of teach us if we're in that situation?
A lot of times what I see is whenever a person is in that type of situation, they find themselves doing things that they shouldn't do.
When they're popular, yeah, that's true. Yeah, you gotta hold on to the popularity, right? But what happens if, I think about, there's all sorts of things out there or people that crowds will flock to. What does this teach us, maybe, if we're kind of one of the people in the crowd, or we're surrounded by people that are just drawn to something or somebody? What lesson might this offer if we're in that position? People don't like the same things for very long, do they? Whatever people are drawn to today, it'll change tomorrow. And if I'm constantly just going with what the crowd likes, my life is going to be very up and down. It's going to be very inconsistent. People are drawn to the popular churches, right? They're drawn to a popular preacher. To look at this another way and through a different angle, what about Jesus? Was Jesus popular in his ministry? Now think about that for a minute. In his ministry, was there a time where he was popular?
Galilean campaign when he was healing people and providing food and performing all kinds of miracles.
Yep. And what about when he goes into Jerusalem? Pretty popular, right? I mean, there's people, he says, you can tell people to be quiet, even the stones will cry out, right? I mean, I imagine that was no small scene when Jesus rides in on that donkey. And then all of a sudden, not long after that, he's crucified, and even his own disciples are nowhere to be found. So what changed? What changed between the triumphal entry and the crucifixion of Jesus, where even his most loyal companions were no longer nowhere to be seen? What changed? Yeah, they did. It wasn't Jesus. What'd you say? Yeah. So Jesus was popular, and then what changed is that he wasn't. He's no longer popular. And I think that sometimes what we want is for Jesus to be popular, and because that would boost our faith. But if my faith is based off of how popular Jesus is, and I'm just going with the crowd, that's not really faith at all. Maybe we're in a time where Jesus isn't very popular, and if we're just in this habit of following the crowd, that's going to be a problem. If we're looking at the things that people look to, right, to be saved. I think Israel, they were looking for a physical king, a physical salvation. Jesus wasn't that. He wasn't the pop Jesus, right? He was different. He was what God wanted him to be. I think it's very easy for us to kind of make the same mistake Israel made. Not that we mistake Jesus' identity as being something that's not, although that happens too, but we look at people to be Jesus for us, right? So we got an election coming up. And whoever wins, no matter who you're voting for, they're going to make the difference in this state, right? And let's turn to Psalm 146, and we can just close with this. Psalm 146. Is that my alarm to be done? Is that what that was? He says in verse 3, "Do not trust in nobles, in a son of man who cannot save. When his breath leaves him, he returns to the ground. On that day his plans die. Happy is the one whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God, the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them. He remains faithful forever, executing justice for the exploited and giving food to the hungry. The Lord frees prisoners." I think a lot of people run campaigns on those types of promises. But I think the idea here is that you're not going to find those promises fulfilled anywhere except in God. And so, it's easy to follow whoever's popular or whatever's popular. Let's make sure that we're people that our faith in Jesus doesn't depend on him being popular as well. And so that's what I have for you this evening. Again, Solomon kind of brings up a lot of objections to this idea that God is in control, that there's a plan, that he's made everything beautiful in its time. In chapter 5, after he brings up some objections, he's going to give kind of some answers to some of those ideas, and he'll kind of come back to some of the things he's brought up. And so that's what I have for you this evening. Thanks for your participation and comments. Really appreciate it.